Good morning. Today is Thursday, April the 9th. I'm going to go over the independent practice in your reading workbook for today and tomorrow. All right, so you should be seeing this. Okay, you should be seeing this passage on your screen now. We've got some words that we need to figure out what they mean before we begin reading. We've got magnificent, merchant, tolerate, and frustration. And if we don't know what those words mean, we can read the passage and use our context clues to take a guess about what those words may mean.
Hello.
Okay, so let's begin reading. This is a Korean folk tale. A magnificent shade tree once grew near the house of a greedy merchant. Every day, the merchant sat under the tree. One warm day, a young man stopped to rest under the tree too. "Oh!" cried the merchant. "What do you think you're doing, sitting in my shade?" "The tree belongs to everyone," he said. "It is mine. However, I am willing to sell you the shade," declared the merchant. "No one owns shade," said the young man. "I own the tree. Therefore, I own the replied the merchant. The young man paid the greedy merchant. As the hours passed, the shade moved with the sun. When the shade moved into the merchant's yard, the young man did too. The merchant frowned. Then the shade moved onto the merchant's front porch. The young man followed. The merchant gritted his teeth. Finally, the shade moved right into the merchant's magnificent house. The young man moved right in with it. This was more than the merchant could tolerate. "What do you think you're doing?" he shouted. "I'm simply following my shade," said the young man. The young man had indeed bought the shade. The next day, the young man returned and brought his relatives. His children laughed and played in the shade. His uncles and cousins sang and danced. The merchant could hardly hear himself think. Finally, he shouted, "I want to buy back my shade." "You sold it to me, and I intend to keep it," the young man shouted back. The merchant retreated to his house in frustration. Soon after that, the merchant moved far away. The young man moved into the magnificent house, and to this day, travelers are welcome to share the shade. All right, so let's think about some things. Use what you learned from reading The Shade Seller to answer the following questions. What do we learn about the merchant at the beginning of the story? So the beginning, when the story starts, what do we learn about the merchant? Let's go back into our passage. A magnificent shade tree once grew near the house of a greedy merchant. Every day the merchant sat under the tree. Let's see what our choices are. He often argues with people who sit in his yard. He doesn't like it when people sing and dance. He sits under the tree near his house every day. He doesn't know that the shade moves with the sun. So what do we learn about the merchant at the beginning? Well, right here, it says that every day, the merchant sits under the tree. So which answer choice talks about him sitting under his tree? C. He sits under the tree near his house every day. Okay, number 2. This question has 2 parts. First answer part A, then answer part B. When does the problem begin? So the problem in the story, when does it begin? When the merchant finds the young man sitting where the merchant likes to sit? When the young man says that no one owns the shade? When the merchant yells at the young man for moving into his house? When the young man brings his relatives to the merchant's house? When does the problem begin? Well, the problem begins when he finds him sitting where he likes to sit. That's how it all starts. All right, because in paragraphs 2 and 3 is when we're introduced with this problem. That's when the merchant claims that the young man is using the shade that he owns. That's how the problem gets started. Now let's look at part B. Write the sentence that tells what the merchant wants the young man to do in order to sit in the shade of the tree. So you're just going to find the sentence straight from the passage that tells what the merchant wants the young man to do to be able to sit there. What does he want him to do? Well, if you look back, turn back in the passage.
Oh, that monkey's me. This monkey's me.
All right, if you look in paragraph 5, it says, "It is mine. However, I am willing to sell you the shade," declared the merchant. So that's the sentence that we are going to put on part B. He says, and I've got it in quotation marks because I'm taking this sentence directly from the passage. These aren't my words. These are straight word from word for the passage, so I've got it in quotation marks. However, I am willing to sell you the shade, declared the merchant. All right, so in order to let him sit there, he told him he would sell it to him. So the young man is going to buy it from him because this merchant is a very greedy person. All right, what do you think the word greedy means? That's what we're fixing to talk about on number 3. We're going to talk about what we think the word greedy means. Number 3, at the beginning of the story, the author says that the merchant is greedy. Find 2 details in the story that show the merchant is greedy. Write them on the lines. All right, so I've kind of added over here to the side what the word greedy means, okay? Greedy is a synonym for being selfish. If you're a greedy person, you want everything for yourself. So he wanted everything for himself. He didn't want to share with anybody. He was very selfish. So what are 2 details from the story that show that he's greedy or that he's a selfish person? 2 details from the story. Well, what does he want to do? What does he ask the young man to do since he wants to sit in his shade? He says he's going to sell it to him. So that's the first thing. He wants money. Very, very greedy. Okay? So the merchant wants to sell the shade to the young man. And also, what does the merchant say that he owns? He says because he owns the tree that he owns the shade too. All right, so that shows just how greedy of a person this merchant is. The young man brings his family to the house. Read the sentence that tells what the merchant did. The merchant retreated to his house in frustration. Retreated. Does that mean went away from, went back inside, looked behind, or tore down? All right, well, let's talk about A, C, and D. Let's talk about went away from, looked behind, or tore down. Did it say anything about him leaving in that part that he went away from, that he looked behind it, or he tore it down? No. Retreats mean to go back inside something. So he retreated to his house in frustration. He went back inside. He goes back into the house to get away from the noise of the family. All right, let's keep going. And you do not have to do all of this today. If you would like to do part of it today and part of it tomorrow, that's fine. You can pause this video and then you can come back to it later to finish it on out, whichever you prefer. But I'm just going to keep going all the way through it and go through the end of it today. All right, how does the merchant's problem change during the story? Below are details. Write them in the part of the chart where they fit best. All right, so we've got beginning, middle, and end. So we've got to put the details where they fit best, if they were at the beginning, the middle, or the end. And we have the family moves into the house for good. The young man follows the shade into the house. The merchant sells his shade to the young man. The young man brings his family to enjoy the shade. A young man stops to rest under a tree. The merchant moves away. All right, so what of these right here, what is the very first thing that happens in this story? If you go back through it, these that are here, of these, the first thing that happens is this one. A young man stops to rest under a tree. So we're going to plug that in at the beginning.
I wrote this. I tried it off so I can.
Can't figure out how to make this smaller. Guess that's the best I can do. Okay, now I'm gonna mark that out so we know that we've used it already. Okay, now we need one more thing that happens in the beginning. So after the young man stops to rest under the tree and he meets the merchant, what happens next of these details right here? The merchant sells his shade to the young man, right there. So we're going to plug that in also in the beginning of the story. Okay, so all of that goes on the beginning of the story. All right, now let's talk about the middle of the story. In the middle, so what's the very next thing that happens? What does the young man end up doing as the shade moves? He ends up following the shade into the house, right there. So that's going to be the first thing on the middle. Young man follows the shade into the house. Okay, and then what does he do? He's enjoying the shade, so he decides to bring who to come with him? His family. The young man brings his family to enjoy the shade. All right, so all of that goes in the middle. All right, and then the last two go at the end, okay? But what happens first, okay? First, at the end of the story, the family moves into the house for good. And because they've moved into his house, what does the merchant do? He moves away. All right, so we've plugged in all of those details. All right, so I'm gonna move on to number 6. So I'm gonna have to scroll down. If you need to pause this video to get those answers down in your workbook, that's fine. But I'm gonna clear it now and move down on the page so we can do number 6. How did the merchant's problem change during the story? Explain what happened and whether the problem was ever solved. Use details from the story in your answer. All right, so at the beginning of the story, what was his problem? His problem was very minor at the beginning. It was a small problem. All right, so let's go ahead and type in what the problem was at the beginning. At the beginning of the story, the merchant's problem was a simple problem. Okay? What was that problem? He didn't want the young man where? Sitting in his shade. Okay, so then, how does he think he's going to solve that problem? He tries to solve that problem by doing what? By selling the shade to the young man. Okay, but this only does worse. This only creates a bigger problem. Because then what happens? The young man follows the shade that he bought right into the merchant's house. Okay, so now he's inside the merchant's house, and the merchant realizes he's got a much bigger problem than losing his shade. He's losing his house also. All right, so finally, not only does the young man move in, finally the young man brings his whole family to enjoy the shade. Okay, the merchant realizes what? He can't fix the problem because he sold the young man his shade, so he moves away.
You want a pirate? I'll pirate you.
I'm gonna move that up so you can see all of it. All right, so number 6. At the beginning of this story, the merchant's problem was a simple problem. He did not want the young man sitting in his shade. He tries to solve the problem by selling the shade to the young man. This makes the problem get worse. The young man follows the shade that he bought right into the merchant's house. Finally, the young man brings his whole family to enjoy the shade. The merchant realizes he can't fix this problem because he sold the shade and moves away. All right, so that is the end of your independent practice in your reading. This is on your lesson plan for today and tomorrow. So you can do it all at one time, or you can do part of it today, part of it tomorrow, whichever you prefer. You're gonna clear this, scroll down, and I want you to think about this to yourself or with a grown-up. Explain how the parts of the story work together, and how do 3 parts make the story interesting. So how do the beginning, the middle, and the end, how do they work together to make a story interesting? Think about all the stories you've read this week and how they all had a beginning, a middle, and an end. How do they all work together to make a story and to make that story interesting? That's what you're going to write right there. All right, I hope you all have a fantastic day. Keep working hard. You've all done a really, really, really good job the past few weeks, and I hope to continue working hard with all of you. But most importantly, I hope that I get to see you soon. All right, bye guys. Keep reading, keep learning. Love you.